Good morning, everyone. Uh, I am Toni Coral Evans. I am the Training and Special Projects Administrator at the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. And it is my honor and pleasure to be here today with you to talk about the intersection of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And so if I could just, I'm very much believe in interaction. So if I could, get you to put in the chat, I see some of you are putting in where you're from already. And I see that we've got definitely some military people here, and I love working with our military. Welcome to you. I think Fort Sam Houston's the furthest away I've seen. So welcome to from Texas. Va Beach, you're only about an hour from me. Oh, wait, Alberta and Canada, I think just beat Texas. If you would please put in the chat, do you work with sexual assault survivors, intimate partner violence survivors, or both? Who do you normally work with? Sexual assault survivors, intimate partner violence survivors, or both? Okay. I see a lot of you are saying both. Some say mostly one or the other. Sexual assault. Okay. Sexual assault and harassment. Okay, great. That just gives me an idea of who is in the room, so that I know, kind of who I'm talking to. So a lot of you already work with both. So you're familiar with both of these things. So we're going to go ahead and just dive right in here. And if we can go ahead and just move the slides, please. This is all about me. You can read about me later. Those of you who are military adjacent, you will notice on there that I was the Safe Helpline Manager and the Safe Helpline Follow-Up Specialist for the Department of Defense. So I love the fact that we have so many military people here. That's awesome. All right, we can keep going. These are our learning objectives for today. Defining domestic violence and identifying common dynamics of domestic violence and tactics used by abusive partners to maintain power and control. Highlighting the intersections of intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and demonstrating best practices when screening for intimate partner violence and providing crisis intervention. So the very first thing that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and you have seen this, I am sure many, many, many times, is the power and control wheel. And one of the things that I think for years, we focused very, very heavily on the physical aspects of of intimate partner violence, which included physical violence and sexual violence. And of course, those are incredibly important parts. I'm dropping a copy of the power and control wheel in the chat because I know that it's hard to read and see on the slide. So if you don't have a copy handy with you. So what we realize, though, is that all of the things on the inside of the power and control wheel are flags. They are things that we may often see well before we see any kind of physical violence. The idea of using coercion and threats, making and carrying out threats to hurt somebody, threatening to hurt a family member, threatening to commit suicide, forcing them to do something against their will, coercion. Using intimidation. This is the looks, the gestures. It's somebody doing the, slashing the throat motion with their finger, or maybe just looking over at a cabinet where the person knows they keep a gun. Or it could be something like punching a wall right next to their head. In any case, the intimidation is done to indicate to somebody, whatever this is, I can do this to you. So I can get to that gun and use it on you. If I'm abusing the dog or the cat, I could do that to you. We know that abuse of pets is used as a major form of intimidation. Using emotional abuse, putting somebody down, just like constantly putting them down, telling them they're worthless, they're lazy, they're fat, they're ugly, nobody else will want them, calling them names, making them think they're crazy, playing mind games, right? Humiliating them in front of friends and family if they even have any left. Because, of course, the next thing on the wheel is isolation. And we know that isolation is a major tactic, whether that is physical isolation by moving somebody from an area where they know people to an area where they don't, or whether it is psychological isolation where they simply tell them, convince them that their friends don't have their best interests at heart. Their family, usually it's your family hates me. They don't want you to be happy. And so they mentally isolate them, even though the person could physically pick up the phone and call at any point. They're afraid to, both because they're afraid of how the abusive partner will react, but also because the abusive partner has convinced them that the reception on the other end of the line is not going to be positive. Going on from there, we get into minimizing, denying, and minimizing, denying, and blaming, which you may have heard of called gaslighting. So making light of the abuse and not taking it seriously, saying, oh, it wasn't that bad, or I didn't hit you, that was just a playful slap, to the point where it's, I didn't hit you, you fell down, even though the person knows that they were hit. Shifting the responsibility. If you had had dinner on the table when I got home at 5 o'clock last night, I wouldn't have been so angry. If you hadn't been so mean to me yesterday, I wouldn't have gone out drinking last night and then come home and done that, right? Using children is a horrible tactic, and abusive partners know that, and so they will use it. They will make the children be go-betweens. They will make the children feel guilty if the person is thinking about leaving, using the "you're splitting up our family." They will use, if the person does leave, they'll use visitation and transfer of the children if it's granted, if there's joint custody of some sort, to continue to harass and manipulate the victim. Using privilege, whether this is male privilege or any other privilege that somebody might have, treating somebody like they're less than, just because they're not male, because they're not cisgendered, because they're not white, because they're not of a certain religion, because they don't have documents, right? So anytime they can use privilege, this we'll speak specifically to using male privilege, where they make all the decisions, and the victim's thought process doesn't matter. And then finally, using economic abuse. Economic abuse is something that we see in 94 to 99% of all intimate partner violence cases. This is one of the earliest red flags that you will find for intimate partner violence, and it takes a myriad of forms. It can be anything from not letting the person work, not letting the person go to school so that they can get a better job, keeping the person on an allowance, not letting the person have access to any of the finances, making all of the decisions about how money is spent. It can also include coerced debt or identity theft debt, where the perpetrator, the abusive partner, takes out credit cards, lines of credit, home loans, car loans in the victim's name. And the survivor doesn't even know about it until they've left the relationship and they go to try to get an apartment, and they find out that their credit score is absolutely terrible because the partner defaulted on all of those credit cards. They just ran up the debt and then never paid it because they knew it wasn't in their name. And so this is often one of the earliest signs that you might see of intimate partner violence, is this control of money and how money is spent. So it's something to keep an eye out. I want to let all of you know that as we go through this, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and so you can unmute, because I'd really like this to be more interactive than just me speaking at you for an hour and a half. So the following video that we're going to play is really dealing for younger people, but it encompasses a lot of the tactics that I just showed, that I just discussed in a visual form. And I think it's really helpful to see it in the visual way. And also, this is a great video to use. We're noticing a trend of younger and younger survivors accessing services. And so when we're trying to talk about what do healthy relationships look like as opposed to unhealthy relationships, this gives really detailed, just examples in a cartoon format that's really good for illustrating IPV tactics. So we can go ahead and play that.
It's not playing. Do you have the link?
I do.
Does this video have captioning?
Wow. I just put the link in the chat. So if you just want to share that screen, you can do that, or I can do it.
Remy, do you know if this video has captioning?
It does.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Leah, did you just want me to share my screen and play it?
You can.
Okay.
One of my best friends was in an abusive relationship for so long, and none of us knew anything about it. I'm heartbroken. I thought we told each other everything. Maybe if I had spoken up, she would have talked to me about it sooner. So, here goes. Intimate partner violence, sometimes called teen dating violence or domestic violence, is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. An intimate partner is a person's boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, partner, or lover. Intimate partner violence may include different kinds of abuse. Physical abuse may include hitting, kicking, punching, or other kinds of physical violence. Emotional abuse may not include physical violence, but it can be equally as harmful. When someone is abused emotionally, they may be called names, humiliated, yelled at, or made to feel intimidated. The abuser may try to control the other person by telling them what to do, what to wear, or where they can and cannot go. Financial abuse is when a person tries to control and limit their partner's access to money so that the partner will be dependent on them. One example would be if the person discouraged or disallowed the partner to work and make their own money. Another is if the person takes the partner's money or credit cards and refuses to give them back. Another form of abuse is known as stalking and harassment. Stalking or harassing someone may include spying on them or following them around and constantly showing up where they are or refusing to leave when asked. Stalking also can include sending harassing or unwanted emails, texts, or posts. Finally, There is partner abuse that involves sexual abuse. This type of violence is when a person forces their partner to participate in sexual acts or behaviors without their consent or ignores the partner's sexual boundaries. Just because a person is in an intimate relationship with someone doesn't mean that they must have sex with them or do sexual things that they find uncomfortable or demeaning. If you or someone you know is being abused in a relationship, it's important to know that it's never the fault of the abused person, and it's important to ask for help. To get help.
Okay. So as you can see, even though that is aimed at younger people, it really does go over these abusive tactics pretty clearly. And it gives, an idea of how people react to them, right? That demeaning behavior and how it makes the person feel, right? So going on, we're going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of intimate partner violence. And so on the next slide, we're looking at it. We know that right now the numbers say that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men are going to be victims of intimate partner violence, right? Domestic violence is found in all socioeconomic levels and varying experiences of education, race, culture, gender, sexual orientation, physical and mental ability, and age groups. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. During 1 year, this equates to more than 10 million women and men. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner contact sexual violence, and or intimate partner stalking with impacts such as injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, and use of victim services. On a typical day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. So for those of you who are working in our dual centers, you know what this is like. And those of you who are working at rape crisis only centers, those numbers are very similar. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the national prevalence of sexual assault and the connection to sexual violence and intimate partner violence, 46.7% of female and 44.9% of male survivors of rape in the United States were raped by somebody they knew. Of these, 45.4% of female rape victims and 29% of male rape victims were raped by an intimate partner. Since the pandemic began, DV rates have increased, and we know that that was something that we had been looking at as a trend. We know that hotline numbers, requests for services have all gone up. And we also know that the severity of cases has increased over the last 3 years. We thought that we would hit a plateau, things would start to go back down, and instead the numbers just keep going up, as does the severity of the cases. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see where we talk a little bit here about intersectionality and racial disparities, right? The lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and other violence significantly increases when you are talking about races that other than white or Caucasian. 1 in 3 Latina women will experience intimate partner violence. Over 84% of Native women experience violence during their lifetimes. The range that you see for Asian and Pacific Islanders is that there are some real discrepancies in the studies. Somewhere between 21 and 55% reported experiencing IPV or sexual assault during their lifetime. And 45.1% of Black women, that is nearly half, and 40% of Black men have experienced intimate partner violence, intimate partner sexual violence, or intimate partner stalking. So those numbers are really huge. And we have to be aware that when it comes to racial disparities, that it is a major indicator that you are going to see higher numbers among these populations. We go on to the next slide. We're looking instead here at being a member of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. We see that both bisexual women and bisexual men have the highest risk for lifetime prevalence of physical violence, rape, and stalking. Lesbian women have a higher risk than straight women do. And these are statistics that were collected from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence study conducted by the CDC in 2018. And we know that also in male same-sex relationships, only 26% of men call the police for assistance after experiencing near lethal violence. So that's a really terrifying thought. It's not just that they're experiencing intimate partner violence, it's that they're experiencing near lethal violence, and only slightly over a quarter will still make a report. So the problem we have also is that there are not as many studies on transgender individuals, although we do know that transgender individuals confront similar, if not higher levels of physical violence, rape, and stalking. We know that especially Black transgender women are at the highest danger of fatality. So before we go any further, I just want to take a minute to kind of unpack some of those things and see when you look at those numbers, what does that tell you? What does that make you think when you look at those numbers and you hear those numbers about racial disparities and gender and sexual orientation disparities? How is that going to impact you in your work? We have a lot of work to do. Yep. Tells me there are a lot of offenses not reported. That is very true. There's a lot of things that aren't reported. And we have to acknowledge that it is absolutely the choice of a survivor whether they want to report or not. And we try to honor that choice as much as we can. And we also have to accept the fact that in certain communities, the decision to go to the police is a very perilous one, and one that people have to negotiate in a way that is very different. So we need to be aware of that is not always the answer. And as a matter of fact, for some people, it might never be the answer. Many in the queer and trans community don't report because they're afraid of being outed or harassed by the cops themselves. Yes. So we need better training for law enforcement as well. Great. Thanks for putting that stuff in the chat. Education about healthy relationships needs to start before kindergarten. Nicole, you are singing my song. I believe very strongly in from the most basic, you should, don't tell your kids they have to go give grandma or grandpa or Aunt Sally or Uncle Tom a hug just because they came over to visit or brought them a present, right? We need to teach our children bodily autonomy from a very young age. We have to address the culture of the person and not versus just the violence, right? We have to be aware of all of these different things that impact how somebody experiences violence, right? And we also have to be aware of poly victimization. When you're experiencing community violence and you're experiencing historical generational trauma and you're experiencing personal trauma, how all of those things intersect. So the following numbers that you see here are about the number of services that people requested on a single day in Maryland. And so every year, the National Network to End Domestic Violence does a count. And in 2021, they did it on September 9th. And you can see that there were across Maryland, 1,064 total contacts by survivors with services. 762 received direct services, 302 were hotline calls. And of the 762 who received direct services, 366 were served in shelter and 396 received supportive services. Now, if you go to the next slide, you're going to see that in 2022, just a year later, there was a huge increase, right? Over 1,200 total contacts, over 1,000 received services, and 540 were served in shelter. That was a 47.5% increase over 2021. The 2023 numbers aren't out yet. They'll be out in time probably for the June training, but we usually get them in May. So I don't have the 2023 numbers. It'll be interesting to see if the numbers have gone down or whether this trend is continuing. I think that it is the result of how our society has changed when it comes to mental health as well as support to victims. I'm Khadijah. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Khadijah. Yes. And mental health has become a major issue. I know in both shelters and in services being offered, much more severe mental health cases coming in, a lot more trauma, a lot more cases of substance use, right? Amanda says, we have implemented as part of our hotline greeting, asking the person what pronouns they prefer, baby steps. Oh, Amanda, that is awesome. Yes. And yeah, people are not as afraid to report. Yeah. And I think that we're starting to remove some of the stigma, and we need to keep doing that, right? We need to keep saying to people, removing the stigma. And one of the easiest ways, both around things like what Amanda said, asking about pronouns, is when you answer a hotline call and you get somebody on the other line and you say your name, whether you're using your real name or a pseudonym. I'm Tony, my pronouns are she, her. You don't even have to ask them. All you have to do is say what your pronouns are, and you're already making the invitation for somebody to say their pronouns to you, right? Because you're putting it out there that, hey, I know what this is. I know what this means. And then the person can come back to you if it's important to them and say, oh, my pronouns are they, them. Great. Awesome. Now we know. And so we need to also continue, as Khadijah has said, to work to reduce this stigma on mental health, right? And I think COVID in some ways really did start to reduce some of the stigma, because we started to see so many people suffering from mental health issues. And once people start to see that in themselves, it's easier to recognize that maybe it happens to other people. And so many people during COVID realized they were having a hard time coping with lockdown, coping with isolation, coping with losing friends and family that they did not have a chance to say goodbye to. And suddenly it's easier to empathize with other people who are having those same types of mental health issues, right? We all experienced a collective trauma of COVID. We went through that together. Anybody who lived through it has that trauma and knows what trauma feels like now. And so if you can tap into that, and we can get more people to tap into that and use that empathy, that is going to help us as we move forward, for sure and for certain. Great point. If we can go to the next slide. So illustrating protective orders and the numbers in Maryland in 2022. Again, we don't have the 2023 numbers yet. This is from, we get these numbers from the Maryland Judiciary Statistical Abstract. And over 32,000 protective orders were requested in fiscal year 2022. Let me just say, to contrast this, before the pandemic, that number wasn't even 20,000. So just so you know, over 20,000 temporary protective orders were granted, and 9,767 final orders of protection were granted. And so it's important to see that even though 32,000 were requested, only 9,700, right? So just a little between a third and a quarter were actually resulted in final protective orders. So what happened to all those other ones? Where did they go? Where did they wind up? Did people rescind them? Did people not show up? Did they not get served? What happened to those, other 23,000? All right, next slide, please. So in 2022, there were 56 intimate partner violence related fatalities in Maryland. This was following 2021, where there were 58, and 2020, where there were 56 as well. These numbers were beginning to become kind of burned in our brains here at the network. This year, there has been a reduction. While we are pleased that there is a reduction in the number of homicides, I can't say I'm happy to report that we had only so many homicides, because there is no only so many homicides, right? We did have a reduction, 37 IPV related fatalities this year. Now that is a significant reduction. However, that's still 37 too many deaths. I don't have that trifold yet because it's not completed. Our memorial service is at the end of the month, and it'll be released then on February 26th. So I was just editing it this morning though. And so I just wanted to give you that. I mean, it is good news that the numbers are down, that the numbers did not wind up in the 50s again. But I have a hard time saying 37 people's lives lost is good news, right? We also know that there are some very significant takeaways from when we look at the trends of who it is that is being killed. And if we go to the next slide, when we look at these statistics, we can see that 22 women and 4 men were killed by current or former partners. There were 14 bystanders, including 5 children, and this is 2022, not 2021, my apologies, who lost their lives to IPV. At least 30 children were left behind due to IPV homicides. 75% of all IPV homicides were committed with a gun. There it is. 37.5% of all IPV deaths resulted from a murder-suicide. And Black women comprise roughly 15% of the Maryland population, but nearly 60% of the intimate partner violence homicides in 2022. And I am very sad to report that that number went up this year. Black women are 16% of the state's population, and we're over 75% of the state's victims of intimate partner homicide. That is nearly 5 times their rate in the population. We need to start working with communities in different ways to reduce those numbers. It is a huge systemic issue, and we cannot ignore it. We have to. We've labeled it. We've recognized it. We accept that it exists, and now we really have to get to work on how do we start lowering those numbers. Next slide, please. Are those numbers similar to national statistics? Our numbers tend to be trending a little higher than national statistics in terms of Black women and intimate partner violence fatalities. Black women are still murdered across the nation at a higher rate than their rate in the population in intimate partner violence. Yes. But our numbers are trending higher than the national statistics. Good question, Amanda. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here I'll give you a moment if you have any other questions on the things we've talked about so far, the statistics, kind of this deep dive into intimate partner violence, because now we're going to kind of start talking about the overlap between intimate partner violence and sexual violence, right? So if there's any questions, here's a good time to ask. Also gives me a chance to take a sip of water and a sip of coffee. And gives our lovely interpreters a chance to do the same. We thank you very much. Okay, so moving on, defining intimate partner sexual violence. So it is any sexual contact or activity with an intimate partner, making a person feel uncomfortable. Here's the important part, with the purpose of controlling through fear, threats, coercion, manipulation, or violence. You can experience something that is uncomfortable with an intimate partner that is sexual in nature and not have it be intimate partner sexual violence. It can be a moment where it's like, oh, that is something I am not comfortable with. And if the person is like, oh, I am so sorry, maybe we should have talked about this before, that is not intimate partner sexual violence. If the person is like, oh, yeah, sorry, my bad, whatever. If the person is even like, oh, I didn't know, and doesn't even really apologize, it still needs to have this purpose of control. However, that purpose of control usually becomes very obvious in the ways that they control through fear, threats, coercion, manipulation, and violence, right? It's pretty clear. It's a pretty clear line for us to see where the difference is. Unfortunately, courts and juries, not so much. But for us, it is a pretty clear line. It is, you said no. And it's one thing if it's, somebody you don't know and you say no. But when you say no and the person's like, no, you are going to do this anyway, that is controlling, right? That is putting you in fear. That is, using coercion. You would do this if you loved me, if you really loved me, that type of thing. That's intimate partner sexual violence. So if we go to the next slide, you will, sorry. You'll see that there's a list of things that intimate partner sexual violence includes, but that it's not limited to. So this can be something like forced nudity. It could be around the house, or forcing the person, for example, to wear clothing they're not comfortable with outside of the home, right? So maybe it's wearing something skimpy outside of the home, or not allowing them to wear underwear in public. And so even though nobody else would know that, the person would know it. Forced viewing of pornography, making the person watch pornography. Sexual degradation and humiliation. Things like peeing on them or making them crawl on all fours without permission, right? Like when they don't have permission to do that. Sexual regulation and monitoring, such as forced inspection of undergarments and regulating the person's clothing. Reproductive coercion. We do an entire session on reproductive coercion in our victim advocate training. We do a whole session on it. So, so this is, just one part. But reproductive coercion includes things like unwanted interference with birth control use, forcing someone to terminate a pregnancy, or forcing someone to not terminate a pregnancy, right? Those are both reproductive coercion. Taking somebody's birth control pills and throwing them out, or taking their birth control pills and replacing them with something else. Unsafe sex practices. This, forcing them to, engage in this. It could include something like stealthing, where they remove the condom without permission, You know, or it could be, you know, having sex without condoms when the partner is fine with that, but they don't know that the abusive partner has a sexually transmitted infection and they don't tell the partner that they have it, right? Unwanted sexual touching, which can be anything up to the things in unwanted vaginal, oral, and or anal intercourse. That can be creating a feeling, situation, or atmosphere where emotional and physical control lead to sexual abuse or rape, or a victim feeling that they have no choice but to submit to the activity. So it could be not that the person is actually forcing them to perform the act, but it could be that they know if they don't perform the act, there is going to be a consequence for it, right? That's the coercive factor. They know that if they don't do this, quote unquote, willingly, that what's going to happen is they're going to be beaten, or something is going to be withheld, or, you know, there's going to be some sort of serious repercussion for it. So when you think about this, what do you see in terms of some of the similarities and some of the differences between sexual assault from someone that the person does not know, right? Or maybe is just an acquaintance, just somebody that they've met, you know, the person that they run into in the line at Starbucks, versus an intimate partner sexual assault? And again, you can feel free to put it in the chat, or you can feel free to raise your hand and unmute. So for IPSV, Amina says emotional abuse and controlling behavior is often used in tandem with the sexual assault. Yes. Khadijah says the feeling of betrayal adds to the situation and mental health when it comes to trust. Yes, there's that feeling of betrayal. Amanda says the only difference seems to be the relationship status. Yes, and the relationship status leads to that that emotional kind of additional layers of abuse that you have, the control that they feel, and the fact, I mean, what is probably the main difference? IPV can escalate over time. Yes, Peter, that's a great point. And it's the fact that it's happening continuously, right? A sexual assault, if we're not talking about like child sexual abuse or something that's going on, like that's an ongoing thing, it can happen over and over and over again. And the layers of abuse, yes, Amanda, 100%. The layers of abuse are much more difficult to recognize and understand, because this is what will happen is somebody may come to you to be talking about a childhood sexual assault, and they are in an intimate partner violence situation and they don't even recognize it. Their partner is raping them and they don't even recognize that, because they're so used to what happened as a child that they're like, well, I'm an adult. Now I'm an adult. I'm in a relationship. It's okay. But it's not okay, because they're not willingly consenting to having this happen. And the partner is using it to control them. Access to the survivor, especially when partners are cohabitating, the health relationships being taught as part of the curriculum. Yes, Stacy, healthy relationships. Again, there is no too early to start talking about healthy relationships. I firmly believe this. Because it becomes the norm. Yes, it becomes the norm. You don't even see it as being something out of the norm. A lot of victims of intimate partner violence don't identify having been sexually assaulted when you're talking to them initially. And it's as you get down the line and you find out things that happened and you're like, oh my word, but they would never identify it as sexual assault or sexual violence because they were in a relationship with the person. Amanda says, I always refer to it as boiling the frog. You don't start at the highest temperature, you increase it over time so the frog doesn't notice until it's too late. That is one of the most terrifyingly accurate descriptions of intimate partner violence I've ever heard. Because it does, it ramps up, right? And so oftentimes, if you're working in, a dual center and you're working with somebody in an IPV situation, they may not be bringing up the sexual violence at all. And it's something that does need to be dealt with. And if you're working with somebody who comes into you for a sexual violence, in terms of a childhood sexual abuse, or maybe it is another type of sexual assault that happens that's not their partner. And then you start to kind of dig in and you find out, they came to you and you find out that, well, their partner's the one who put them in this situation in the first place. We see a huge intersection between intimate partner violence, teen dating, and human trafficking, right? So this is where we have to be aware of like similarities and differences. And, in one of the things is with somebody that you don't know, you may not know, like you may think you know your partner's health status. And in many cases you might, in some cases you might not. But with somebody you don't know anything about their health status. So you don't know if they have sexually transmitted infections. You don't know that. You may not know if you'll ever see the person again. You may not be able to describe the person, right? As opposed to the person that you see every day. Great discussion. All right. Let's go on. Here is somebody said, I think it was Peter who said IPV can escalate over time. Yep, here it is. Prior intimate partner sexual violence increases the likelihood of intimate partner homicide by 544%. And numbers like 544% are hard to wrap your heads around. So I created this visual. Imagine that you went in to the rescue shelter to get a dog the size of the little one in the front. And what you came home with was the one in the back. The back dog is roughly 544% the size of the dog in the front. This is to give you the indicator of how big 544% is, because I'm like trying to wrap my head around what is 544%. Oh, this stat is from Risk Factors for Male Perpetration and Female Victimization of Intimate Partner Homicide, a meta-analysis by Chelsea Spencer and Sandra Stith. I will drop that in the chat for you. Yeah. So yeah, Deborah, isn't that a terrifying number? So yeah. So, and again, I do like to, I have that visual because I was like trying to be like, how can I visualize 544% in a way that's more than just a bar graph, right? So you go in looking for a terrier and you come out with a Bernese Mountain Dog. That's 544%. Okay, so how do we go about even starting to talk about this, right? How do we go about when you're screening? So if you are working with someone and the work that you're doing is in, we're going to go back to initial, if we could, Leah, to IPSV screening questions. Question to me, has your partner ever pressured you or forced you into doing something sexually you didn't want to do? Because if you say, has your partner ever sexually assaulted you? 99.99% of your survivors are going to say no. Because you're in a relationship. That can't happen, right? Unfortunately, that's the mindset. Okay. So questions like, has your partner ever pressured you or forced you into doing something sexually you didn't want to do? That's a little different. well, yeah, yeah. I mean, but I went along with it in the end. Okay, but now you know that they did pressure them. Do you feel you can say no to sexual activity with your partner? That's a really good question. Because the follow-up to that is, if you say no, what happens? Because in a healthy relationship, right, if your partner tries to initiate sexual activity and you do not want to have sexual activity, and you say, honey, no, not tonight, not now, whatever. Your partner says, all right. And maybe they give you a kiss on the shoulder, a kiss on the cheek, and that's that. If you're in an unhealthy relationship, they either continue going, or if you say no, the next day is going to be pure Hades. Nothing you do is going to be right. Everything you do is going to be wrong. Plates are going to get broken. What happens if you say no? Do you feel you can say no? If you do say no, what happens? Have you ever been intimate with your partner because you were afraid of them? It's another question that makes somebody really think, was I having a sexual relationship with this person at this moment because I wanted to, or because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't? I was afraid that if I didn't willingly have sexual relations with them, that I would be forced and it was going to hurt. I know of one case where if the partner female tried to say no to sex, he would then rape her anally. So she learned never to say no, because she would rather experience vaginal sex than anal sex. Have you given in to a sexual encounter with your partner to avoid fighting or being hurt? So these are different ways of asking the question, has your partner ever sexually assaulted you, right? Because that question is very rarely going to get a yes answer, unless they've already walked in and said, my partner sexually assaulted me and that's why I'm here. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So, follow-up questions. How often does that occur? It's important to know this, because it's important to know if it was a one-time thing. Was it something that happened once and their partner showed remorse, or, it was, there was a circumstance or something, it's never happened again? Or is this something that is just ongoing and part of their relationship? Are there patterns that you notice? So, for example, her partner plays cards every Thursday night with the boys. And if he wins at cards and comes home, he's in a good mood, everything is fine. But if he loses at cards, he's going to sexually assault her. Why is it important to notice patterns like that? Because maybe then you can safety plan, if the person is staying in the relationship, for things like, could you arrange on Thursdays that maybe, oh, it's your card night, I'm going to use that night to go to my friend's house? Are there ways to safety plan around that? What would happen if you told them that you did not want to do something? Is there any level of respect that the partner has where they would say, okay, or is it always going to be, you're going to do it or life is going to be miserable? This is a very difficult question, and you may or may not want to ask it. It depends on the relationship you've built with the person. But this is important for finding out about the need for things like medical care. Can you tell me some of the things they force you to do as their partner? Because, for example, if they are using objects on them, or if they are forcing them anally, there's some medical concerns that you probably are going to want to have checked out, right? Do they use other things that inflict pain, right? Are there other things that medically need to be looked into? And I know, so that question can be really hard to ask. And so you really need to have a relationship with the person and develop it. But it is important to, after you've developed that rapport, to make sure that if there is a medical need, that you are able to get the person to medical help. And then here's a question that can help somebody as they're starting to try to think about if they're thinking about leaving their partner. What do you think would happen if you told them that you were in pain? Because we understand pain on a very visceral level. And normally, if you tell somebody, ouch, that hurts, what does the person do? They stop, right? You know, even if you're in the doctor's office and the doctor says, I'm going to touch here, I'm going to touch here, I'm going to touch. Oh, okay, that's tender. We're not going to touch there anymore, right? So normally, if somebody accidentally puts you in pain, they're going to stop. So if you get them to understand that if you tell your partner, I'm in pain, and your partner does not care, that can lead them through states into a new stage of change. That can be a realization moment. I see Salitha, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. If I'm not, please correct me. Do you have any information you can share for male victims? I have little information on male victims due to them underreporting. Yes. All of these questions are also valid for male victims. And we know that men are far less likely to report because of stigma. So you really have to, when you're working with male victims, you really have to try to normalize it as much as possible. And I think that is one of the hardest things to do, but to let them know this is not uncommon. Men do experience this, right? Men experience intimate partner violence. 1 in 9 experiences severe physical, sexual, or stalking violence in their lifetime, right? That's normalizing it and letting them know that this is not uncommon is a huge thing with men, especially in the military environment. Yes. One of the things I've learned when working with men in the military is when I use things like the 1 in 9, because again, numbers can be very abstract. They'll say, how many people are in your platoon? How many people are in your company? Then you do the math, right? That means that there are 7 other men in your company who in all likelihood have at some point experienced this. You just don't know because they don't talk about it. But they're there. They're out there just like you are. They're suffering like you in silence. But you don't have to suffer in silence anymore. Now you can talk to me. I am here for you to talk to. And remember, this is what the statistics tell us, right? So if your company is 36, your platoon is 36 people, and it's 1 in 9, that means there's 3 other guys in your platoon who have also experienced this in all likelihood. And somehow that makes it more real for them, right? I will often say when I do trainings, I'll do the math and I'll be like, we have this many participants in this training. We are the people we serve. It is likely that there are this many of us who have experienced one of these forms of violence, right? So we need to be aware of who we're sitting next to. And that works. I think that works really well for men. They like concrete examples, especially in the military. It's so hard because you have the additional layer of machismo that goes on top of everything. And so you really have to break down and be like, it is not about being weak. It is not about a lack of strength or a lack of character or a lack of courage. It is about the fact that somebody else abused you. They made a bad choice and they chose to hurt you. You did nothing wrong. And we have to keep emphasizing that for all survivors, but especially men in the military. It's like this person chose to abuse their power and control. And especially you see that when there are differences in rank or power that comes with different privileges because of race or gender identity or sexual orientation. Great question. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So here are some, general questions, and you all are in the field, these. These are the general questions. How can I help you, right? Like open-ended, right? We want to be as open-ended as we can be when we're offering help, right? How can I help you? What do you want? What do you need? Making sure that we are not putting our idea of what the survivor needs first over what the survivor needs. Now, again, if there is medical treatment required, we want to try to make sure that we get that in there. But maybe, for example, the survivor is concerned with how do I stay safe in a particular situation? And you're thinking, well, I've got to figure out how to get you to leave this person. And they're like, I'm not leaving. I just want to know how to be safe on Thursday nights when he comes home from his poker game. So, that's important to find out. Never be afraid to say, when you say blank, what do you mean by that? The example that I use is hotline example. We had somebody come on the hotline. It was a chat line, so we didn't have a voice. It was just chat, and said, my daddy is hurting me. So when you hear that in the chat, what is the first thing you think of about the person who is making the hotline call, who's on the chat with you? My daddy is hurting me. What comes to your mind? Deborah's child. Is that what most people are thinking? Child, Nicole. Yep. So a lot of people will, and we would get a lot of calls on the National Sexual Assault Hotline from children on both the chat and the phone, but a lot of times on the chat, because kids are like with the phones, right? Like, and the chat thing, they're, when I need my phone fixed, I give it to my 11-year-old granddaughter and I'm like, here, Summer, fix this. Because they know more about it than I do. So when you're, that's your first reaction. So you start talking and you start asking questions. And then the person says something like, yeah, when we went out to the club, I felt, he made me do something I really didn't want to do. Now who are we thinking the person on the other end of the line is? Nicole says, are we talking about, are they talking about their pimp? Right? Because daddy is a term used in human trafficking, right? It could be their pimp. We went out to the club and he made me do something I didn't want to do. Could be their partner, right? So maybe you say, so can you tell me a little bit more? You see the next question. When you say they made you do something you didn't want to do, what do you mean by that? And then the person says, well, I don't like being tied up, but he made me get tied up. Now what are we talking about? Daddy tied me up where other people could see me. when we were at the club. Still adults, but not sure of capacity, right? This could be a BDSM relationship. Daddy is a term, yes, forced exhibitionism. Daddy is a term used in BDSM. So I literally got this chat. I went from thinking it was a child to thinking it was a trafficker to finding out it was a consensual sexual relationship between two adults who were in the kink world, except for that he violated a boundary. And then violated it even worse than what I said. That's three different answers, right? Of how you go about the next questions in your chat, right? So we want to make sure we clarify things. Can you tell me more about that is one of my favorite questions. Can you tell me a little bit more? It's part of forensic interviewing, right? It's part of FETI. Tell me a little bit more about that. Let them lead conversations, right? So that you can try to figure out and see what's going on. And remember, during all of this, we have to remain completely non-judgmental, right? So what happens when it's the person who's in the BDSM relationship who tells you that they submit to, they agree to being spanked, they agree to being hit with a flogger, but they didn't agree to being hit with a single tail whip, and it drew blood and it hurt. You have to stay out of judgment, right? That's hard. And then another question is, can we talk about who you might be able to confide in? Because sometimes we want to, yeah, but Dana, I love it. Boundaries shouldn't be crossed. Full stop. There you go. That's why they're boundaries. And Nicole says it's still the same as saying yes to sex, but then now when you change your mind, you can still change. Absolutely. And so it's important to understand that for a lot of people, kink relationships are really hard to work around. And we have a huge kink community in Maryland, huge. So getting calls from them, not out of the question. So being aware of some of these, some of this terminology and how it can go from a child to a trafficker to a consensual, normally loving relationship that has turned sour and has become an abusive relationship is important. And who can you confide in? Because, you know, you can be there, you can order, you can see if you can get them into therapy and get them into counseling, but do they have a support unit? That's the start to finding out who can they confide in? Do they have a support unit? Is there somebody that they can talk to? Right? Because we want to make sure that they're supported not only when they're in your office, not only when they're on the phone with you, not only when they're seeing their counselor, but that they have other supports in the community. Next slide. So here are tips and guiding principles. The stuff on the left, you all probably do already. Acknowledge the difficulty of the situation, believe them, be prepared for any reaction. Remember, sometimes somebody might start crying. Sometimes they might start screaming at you. To some people, we are part of the system and the system is the problem. So those reactions can be pretty widely varied. We need to consider trauma, all forms of trauma, collective trauma, individual trauma, historical generational trauma, right? We want to keep the conversation open. We want to empathize, not sympathize, right? Brene Brown has that great video on empathy versus sympathy. Empathy is making a connection with somebody, meeting them, you know, we talk about meeting the survivor where they're at, right? That's empathy. Sympathy is, oh gosh, that's bad, right? Like that is not helpful. Also, please always remember there is a second half to that statement about meeting the survivor where they are. I heard this once on a Freedom Network Training Institute, and I don't know the person who said it, but I credit FNTI for this. We want to meet the person where they are, but we don't want to leave them there. We always want to be moving them forward a little bit, at least. And we want to take it slow, step by step, let them lead. Most important and the most difficult thing, especially if you're used to working with sexual assault victims and not intimate partner violence victims, is respect their choices, even if they are staying with the abuser. And that is, I think, the hardest thing to do when you are working with intimate partner violence victims and survivors, is when they've come to you for help and you're like, okay, great, we're going to do there. But they're like, again, I don't want to get out. I just want to know how to stay safe on Thursday night. And you're like, but you just told, your head, the thought bubble is like, but you just told me he rapes you every Thursday night. Why don't you want to leave? But what you have to say here is, all right, let's talk about options for keeping you safe on Thursday night, right? Margaret says, help them to get to where they need to be. Yes. And so that's right now where that person needs to be is I need to be safe on Thursday night, right? So we're going to try to work on that. But we always leave the door open, right? We always give them options to come back. We always let them know. But we have to respect that choice for them to stay. And it is so very hard for people to leave. And so when they're staying, that is when safety planning, that is when you have to really not just think outside the box. Sometimes you have to build a brand new box in safety planning when somebody is staying with the abusive partner. You have to think about things like signals. You have to think about how to get them out if they do decide to get out in a safe way. You need to help them plan for if they do decide to get out. Even if they have no intention of getting out, you're like, well, would it hurt for you to squirrel away the change from the groceries every week someplace safe? If nothing else, you could buy a nice present at the holidays or a birthday or something, right? Okay, let's go on. We have another video here. I hope this one is going to play for you.
No, still not.
You know what? I think maybe are you using the PDF? That might be what it is instead of PowerPoint. That's all right. I can use it. I can play it. I'll just share my screen real quick.
For a woman to leave an abusive partner, it takes an average of 7 attempts. For many victims, the only hope of leaving is women's refuge. Without you, that hope doesn't exist.
So your sites are women's refuge, right? That is an ad from New Zealand. And yes, it's true. You know, you are that light at the end of the tunnel. And it can take so long. And if we can go ahead and
Please donate it.
and I'll have Leah finish sharing here for the rest of the presentation. But it's so important to understand, right? And here's the thing, why do people stay and how can you help when they do? I see Margaret says it takes 7 to 12 times to create a new habit. This video is speaking to how many times they leave. The hard part is addressing why. So the video showing suppressing pain. Yeah. And we know that the average is, they say the average is 7 times to leave, but that number is much higher again for women of color, more like 12 to 14 times. So why do people stay? Why do they stay? What are the reasons that they stay? And you saw some of the things in there that the abusive partner, the tactics that the abusive partner was using. A lot of women I've talked to have trouble leaving because of children or financial limitations. They find it hard to have that stability outside of the relationship. Absolutely. The devil I know is better than the devil I don't. If I leave, where am I going to go? How am I going to support my children? Right? That's why economic empowerment is so important for survivors. One even said that she was afraid the court might grant her partner full custody. Yes, that is a terrifying fear because who has the money to get a good lawyer? Right? Oftentimes it's the abusive partner has the money to get the high-priced lawyer to go into divorce court. The religion, divorce is not a part of their belief. Esmeralda, it's so often in so many different religions, right? I think people like pigeonhole it into certain religions, but there's a lot of religions where that is just not part of the belief. And so it's important to find out if somebody is in a religious situation, is there somebody that you can contact who is in the same religion, but who is sympathetic and empathetic and understands intimate partner violence and will tell them it is okay to leave. We work with a lot of different faith communities, and those faith communities, even though there are certain congregations that would say, no, you can't divorce your partner. We have ones that are like, if your partner is abusing you, they've already broken their covenant. Fear of the unknown. Yeah. Again, the devil I know is better than the devil I don't. I'm going to be homeless. I'm going to be in my car. Where am I supposed to keep my kids? A lot tend to believe that they deserve the abuse because of the emotional manipulation they've gone through. Amina, absolutely. They think that this is normal, right? Somebody said this earlier, like this has just been normalized. So leaving doesn't even make any sense to them, right? They came to you because something happened, but maybe the police were called and they got connected to services because of it, but they didn't reach out. Maybe they reached out, but now they've changed their mind because we know the abusive partner came back with the, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm trying to change, which of course is followed up with not answering, right? Feeling undervalued as a group. Black women may be the reason they were in the relationship in the beginning, coupled with living in a home of abusive partners. And yes, the church until really recently says stay. Yeah. And again, if you grow up in a home where you see abuse and abuse is normalized, you can start to identify with whatever gender it is that is you identify with and how they react. And so we see this, that people, this is what we talk about. We talk about breaking the cycle of violence, both for abusive partners and for survivors, is that we have to step in and say, this is not normal. This is not healthy. This is not the way things are supposed to be. And maybe this is what you saw in your home growing up, but that is not the way that you have to live. And so when people do decide to stay, again, it is that meet the survivor where they are, don't leave them there, help them get to where they need to be at that moment. And then you inch them along, right? It's stages of change. And part of that is creating discrepancy. The survivor has to see where they are, and they have to see where they want to be. And that has to be a different place. Until they can see that they want to be somewhere else, they're never going to leave. But let's say that they do say they want to be in a different place, but they see all the barriers to it. Then at least you can start moving them by explaining how to get past those barriers, right? But first they have to actually decide that this is not where they want to be. They want to be over here. Next slide, please. So if you have any questions, and I know that you have to fill out a form for MCASA. I'm sorry to do this to you, but I really need you to fill out a form for me too. For my grants, our forms are just a little bit different. So I'm going to put it here in the chat. This is our evaluation. If you would be kind enough to please do that for me. It'll also be on your slides. You'll be getting copies of these. My email is on the slides. I'm also dropping it in the chat here. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have any questions. And if you have anything right now, I'd be more than happy to try to answer. And thank you very much to MCASA. We love this partnership. MCASA, we present here at theirs and they present at ours. So somebody will be presenting at ours next month in March. So we love our sister coalition and love being able to come and do this with your advocates. And huge thank you to the ASL interpreters. Really appreciate your talent and abilities.
All right. Thank you so much, Tony. And if there are no questions, we can wrap up. So again, please fill out the evaluation from MNADV. Please fill out MCASA's evaluation. I'll be sending out both evaluations in a follow-up email along with today's recording and the PowerPoint slides for today, as well as the Power and Control Wheel handout and a few other handouts that Tony has for you all. As a reminder, if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or CEU credits for today's training session, you must complete MCASA's evaluation form. Upon submitting the form, you'll see the link to request a certificate of attendance. You can expect to receive your certificate within 3 to 4 weeks. All right. If you have any questions, I'll include Tony's email in my follow-up email. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow for our presentation on the neurobiology of trauma. Thank you.